He was one of their own. He grew up with them. He worked for them. He knew their secrets. And then one day, without warning, he crossed a line that no one in the London underworld had ever dared to cross before. The Krays didn't forget. They didn't forgive. They waited. What happened next was the most violent gang war Britain had ever seen. Bodies dropped, empires collapsed, and it all started because of one man's decision to betray the people who trusted him most. But here's the thing. 60 years later, people still argue about what really happened. Was the betrayal as simple as it seemed, or was there something darker behind it that no one wants to admit? Subscribe now, because this story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. London in the early 1960s wasn't controlled by the police. It was controlled by men whose names were whispered in pubs and betting shops across the city. Two organizations had carved the capital into territories so distinct that crossing from one side to the other felt like entering a different country. The Krays held the east, the Richardsons owned the south, and between them flowed the River Thames, a border more dangerous than any wall. But this wasn't just about geography. It was about something far more fragile: respect. In the underworld, respect was the only currency that mattered. You could steal money, you could lose businesses, but the moment you lost respect, you lost everything. Men who had been untouchable for years could vanish overnight if word spread that someone had humiliated them and gotten away with it. The rules were simple. You didn't talk about the other side in public, you mocked their leaders, and you never, under any circumstances, made one of them look weak. Everyone understood this. Everyone followed it, until one man decided he didn't have to. He wasn't a nobody. He wasn't some low-level criminal looking to make a name for himself. He was someone the Krays had known for years, someone they had trusted, someone who had sat in rooms with them, shared drinks with them, heard things that outsiders never heard. And that's what made what he did next so unforgivable. Because betrayal from a stranger is expected. Betrayal from one of your own, that's the kind of wound that never heals. The Krays had built their empire on fear, but fear only works if people believe the consequences are real. If someone could betray them and walk away untouched, what message would that send? Every criminal in London would be watching. Every rival would be calculating. The twins knew they couldn't let this stand. But they also couldn't act rashly. Moving too fast would look desperate. Moving too slow would look weak. They needed the perfect moment, the kind of moment that would send a message so loud that no one would ever dare cross them again. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, it would be more brutal than anyone expected. But before we get there, you need to understand something about the man who started all of this, because he wasn't just any traitor. He was the worst kind, the kind who betrays you and then laughs about it in public. His name was George Cornell, and in the East End of London, that name carried weight. Cornell was 6 feet tall, built like a docker, and had a reputation for violence that made even hardened criminals think twice before challenging him. He'd grown up on the same streets as the Krays. He'd served time in the same prisons. For years, he was part of their world. But George Cornell had a problem. He didn't know when to keep his mouth shut. In the early days, Cornell worked alongside the Krays, not as a core member, but close enough to know how they operated, close enough to understand their weaknesses, close enough to see the cracks that others missed. He attended meetings. He was present for conversations that should have stayed private. The Krays considered him an ally. That was their first mistake. By 1964, something shifted. Cornell started spending more time south of the river. He was seen drinking with the Richardson brothers, laughing with their enforcers, conducting business that had nothing to do with the Krays. At first, it seemed like nothing. Maybe he was just expanding his connections. Maybe it was harmless. It wasn't harmless. Cornell didn't just drift away from the Krays. He made a calculated decision to join their greatest enemies. The Richardsons welcomed him with open arms. Why wouldn't they? Here was a man who knew the Krays intimately, who understood their operations, who could provide information that would take years to gather otherwise. Cornell became one of the Richardsons' most trusted enforcers almost overnight. The Krays heard about it. Of course they did. Nothing stayed secret in the London underworld for long. But switching sides, while dangerous, wasn't necessarily a death sentence. Men changed allegiances. It happened. What mattered was how you conducted yourself afterward. And that's where George Cornell made his fatal error. He could have kept quiet. He could have stayed in South London and minded his own business. He could have shown the Krays a shred of respect, even from a distance. Instead, he did the opposite. Cornell started talking. He mocked the twins openly. He questioned their power. He made jokes at their expense in rooms full of criminals who would spread every word across the city by morning. But nothing he said would compare to what happened on Christmas Day, 1965. The Astor Club was packed that night. Criminals from both sides of the river had gathered for a holiday party. Drinks were flowing. The atmosphere was tense but controlled. Then Ronnie Kray spotted George Cornell across the room. What happened next would seal his fate forever. Cornell didn't whisper. He didn't mutter under his breath. He said it loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. 3 words aimed directly at Ronnie Kray's deepest insecurity. 3 words that questioned his manhood in an era when such accusations could destroy a reputation overnight. The room went silent. Everyone who heard it knew exactly what those words meant, and everyone who heard it knew that Ronnie Kray would never let them go. A fight broke out immediately. Bodies clashed, glasses shattered, but the real damage wasn't physical. The real damage was done the moment those words left Cornell's mouth. Because Ronnie Kray wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. And humiliation for a man like Ronnie was worse than any wound. Cornell walked out of that party alive. He probably thought he'd gotten away with it. He probably laughed about it with his Richardson friends the next day. What he didn't realize was that he'd just written his own death sentence. Ronnie Kray didn't explode. He didn't send men after Cornell that night. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He waited. He filed that insult away in a place where it would never fade. And he started planning. The problem was, Ronnie couldn't just kill Cornell without consequences. The Richardsons were at the height of their power. An open attack would mean war, and war at that moment wasn't something the Krays were ready for. So Ronnie waited for the perfect opportunity, the moment when Cornell would be vulnerable, the moment when striking would send a message without starting a conflict the Krays couldn't win. That opportunity would come sooner than anyone expected, because in March 1966, something happened that changed everything. A night of chaos that would leave the Richardson organization crippled and George Cornell completely exposed. March 7th, 1966. Mr. Smith's club in Catford, South London. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. Drinks, music, business as usual. But by the time the sun came up, 1 man would be dead, several more would be bleeding in hospital beds, and the Richardson Gang's empire would be crumbling into dust. Nobody saw it coming. The club was packed that evening. Eddie Richardson was there. So was Frankie Fraser, the most feared enforcer south of the river, a man whose reputation for violence was so extreme that people called him Mad Frankie. They were drinking, relaxing, surrounded by allies. They felt untouchable. But there was someone else in that club, someone who shouldn't have been there. Richard Hart was a Kray associate, not a major figure, not a decision-maker, just a man connected to the wrong side who happened to walk into the wrong place at the wrong time. Some say he was there by accident, others believe he was sent deliberately to provoke a reaction. The truth has never been confirmed. What happened next was chaos. An argument broke out, voices rose, glasses were slammed on tables, then someone threw a punch. Within seconds, the entire club erupted. Fists flew, chairs were smashed, and then, cutting through the noise of the brawl, a sound that changed everything. Gunshots. In the confusion, Richard Hart was hit. He collapsed near the bottom of the stairs, bleeding from a wound that would kill him before help arrived. Frankie Fraser took a bullet to the thigh and was found later in a nearby garden, abandoned by his own men. Eddie Richardson was shot in the backside. The club became a crime scene. Police swarmed the area within hours. Arrests followed immediately. Eddie Richardson was taken into custody. Frankie Fraser was hospitalized and then charged. One by one, the key members of the Richardson organization were swept off the streets. The timing was devastating. But there was one name missing from the arrest list. George Cornell wasn't at Mr. Smith's that night. By pure chance, or perhaps by design, he had avoided the bloodbath entirely. While his allies were being handcuffed and interrogated, Cornell remained free. He was one of the last Richardson enforcers still walking the streets of London, and that made him a target. The news of Mr. Smith's spread through the underworld like wildfire. The Richardsons were finished. Everyone could see it. Their leaders were locked up, their enforcers were scattered. The organization that had dominated South London for years was collapsing in real time. Ronnie Kray heard about Richard Hart's death within hours. A Kray associate killed in a room full of Richardson men. It didn't matter that the shooting was chaotic. It didn't matter that no one knew exactly who pulled the trigger. What mattered was the message. A Kray man was dead, and someone had to pay. But Ronnie wasn't thinking about Richard Hart. Not really. He was thinking about something else entirely. Something that had been burning in his mind for months. Those 3 words at the Astor Club, that public humiliation he had never forgotten. George Cornell was still out there, still breathing, still unpunished. And now, with the Richardsons in chaos, Cornell had no protection. The next 24 hours would determine everything. Ronnie knew he had a window, a brief moment when striking Cornell would look like gang retaliation rather than personal revenge. A moment when the underworld would understand the message without questioning the motive. He made his decision quickly. There would be no more waiting, no more planning. George Cornell had insulted him in public and betrayed the Krays to their enemies. Now, with the Richardson organization in ruins, there was nothing standing between Ronnie and the revenge he had been craving for months. On March 9th, Ronnie received a piece of information that made his blood run cold. George Cornell had been spotted. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't running. He was sitting in a pub in Whitechapel, drinking casually, as if nothing in the world could touch him. The pub was called the Blind Beggar, and it was right in the heart of Kray territory. Cornell had walked into the East End alone. Some say he was visiting a friend in the nearby hospital. Others believe he was making a statement, proving he wasn't afraid of the Krays, even after everything that had happened. Whatever his reasons, it was the worst decision he ever made. Because Ronnie Kray was already on his way. 8:30 in the evening. The Blind Beggar was quiet. Just a handful of drinkers scattered around the bar. A record was playing on the jukebox, the Walker Brothers, The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore. Nobody paid attention to the music. Nobody noticed the door opening. George Cornell was sitting at the bar with a drink in his hand, relaxed, calm, like a man who had no idea what was about to happen. He should have known better. Ronnie Kray walked through the door with two men. His driver, Scotch Jack Dixon, waited outside in the car. Ian Barry, his right-hand man, entered with him. They didn't hesitate. They didn't look around. They walked straight toward the bar like men on a mission. Cornell saw them coming. He recognized Ronnie immediately, and in that moment, instead of running, instead of begging, instead of doing anything that might have saved his life, George Cornell smiled. He looked at the most dangerous man in London and opened his mouth. His last words were either, "Well, just look who's here," or, "Well, look what the dogs brought in." Witnesses disagree on the exact phrase, but they all agree on the tone. It was mocking, contemptuous. Even now, facing the consequences of everything he had done, Cornell couldn't resist one final insult. It was the last mistake he ever made. Ronnie didn't say a word. He reached into his coat and pulled out a 9mm Luger. Ian Barry raised his own weapon and fired 2 shots into the ceiling, a warning to everyone in the pub to stay exactly where they were. Then Ronnie stepped forward, raised the pistol, and aimed directly at Cornell's head. 1 shot, just above the right eye. Cornell slumped forward onto the bar. The drink in his hand spilled across the counter. The jukebox kept playing, the same song stuck on a loop now, repeating the same line over and over. The sun ain't gonna shine anymore, anymore, anymore. Nobody moved. Ronnie Kray stood there for a moment, looking at the body of the man who had betrayed him, the man who had switched sides, the man who had humiliated him in front of everyone at the Astor Club. Then he turned around and walked out of the pub as calmly as he had entered. The barmaid was frozen behind the counter. The other customers sat paralyzed in their seats. They had just witnessed a murder in daylight. They had seen the killer's face clearly, and not one of them would say a word. That was the power the Krays commanded. Police arrived within the hour. They questioned everyone who had been in the pub. The barmaid claimed she had been changing a barrel and missed the whole thing. Other witnesses suddenly developed memory problems. They couldn't remember what the shooter looked like. They couldn't remember how many men had entered. They couldn't remember anything useful at all. Ronnie Kray was arrested and put in an identification lineup. Witness after witness was brought in to look at him, and witness after witness refused to point the finger. He was released without charge. The message had been sent, louder and clearer than any words could express. This is what happens when you betray the Krays. This is what happens when you switch sides and mock them in public. This is what happens when you think you're untouchable. George Cornell lay in the morgue. The Richardsons were finished, and the Krays had proven, once again, that their power was absolute. Or so they thought. Because what Ronnie didn't realize was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Not the killing itself. Murders happened in the underworld all the time. The mistake was doing it in public, in front of witnesses. Witnesses who were terrified now, but who might not stay terrified forever. Fear is a powerful thing, but fear fades, and when it fades, people start to talk. The police hadn't given up on the Cornell case. They were watching, waiting, building files, gathering names, and somewhere in the back rooms of Scotland Yard, a detective named Leonard Reed was becoming obsessed with bringing down the Kray Twins once and for all. The clock had started ticking the moment Ronnie pulled that trigger. He just didn't know it yet. But before the law caught up with them, there was still more blood to be spilled, because the Krays weren't satisfied with Cornell's death, and the violence that followed would shock even the hardened criminals of London's underworld. George Cornell was dead. The Richardsons were destroyed. The Krays stood alone at the top of London's criminal world. By every measure, They had won. But victory in the underworld is never what it seems. If you found this story gripping, smash that subscribe button right now. We dive deep into the darkest chapters of British crime history, the stories they don't teach in schools, the secrets that powerful people wanted buried forever. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because the next story we're telling, it's even darker than this one.